just to do some acknowledgements. I'm here, but none of the work that I've done on this is stuff that I've done on my own. I got some Teaching and Quality Enhancement Fund money when I very first started at the University of Huddersfield, and there were a whole group of us involved in looking at the transitions of disabled students into higher education. And that was, that was general. It wasn't just about health. It was about students across the whole of our school, which was health and social work and psychology, sociology, all those things. On the back of that, we got Strategic Health Authority funding, myself and some colleagues at Bradford, where we actually interviewed disabled people in the NHS, disabled students in the two universities, and we designed a survey which just under 196 people responded to the survey, who were all clinical practitioners within our local trust areas. On the back of that, I got involved with the Disability and Professional Practice Special Interest Group, which is my connection with Phil and Francis, which has been really, really useful to be in this sort of community of people who get disability in practice, if you like. And the last thing that I've been involved with, which we're still working on, I'll still be working on it when I'm 80, I think, is one of the things that came out of the research was the need for risk assessment. And we have developed the Preparation for Practice self-assessment tool, which is free. It's available online. If anybody wants to log on and have a play with it, look at the resources in it, you might find it useful. If you want to collaborate with us to develop it, we would love to talk to you. It isn't designed for health students. It's designed for any student going into a placement area. And like, I'm sorry, I wrote this down so I would remember people's names, and I've forgotten your name already. I do apologise. Like Lisa, we are finding that placement issues are across the university now, as we increasingly expect all students to have access to the world of work as part of their programmes. So that's the background. Dozens and dozens of people there involved along the way. The context for me is this is about student learning in practice, and the things that create a dilemma are the professional bodies, placement concerns, the universities need to have strategies, and equality of legislation. And I just want to say a couple of words about each of those. It was a really good discipline coming here today, because obviously I'm in a different country now. And normally when I rattle on about this, I talk about the Equality Act of 2010 in the UK. And what I found when I started looking at the stuff you have here in Ireland, but also going back to the EU directives, is that we are more the same than we are different. The equality legislation that's around is very similar. You've talked about accommodations this morning, we talk about adjustments. But really the ethos, the philosophy, the fact that you, like us, have got the clause about competence, that we really want to look after our disabled students, but the bottom line is, in any profession where competency is at issue, every single person's got to hit that bar in terms of competency, regardless of whether they're disabled or not. And I found this particular EU paper was really, really useful, and it's a comparative study of India, Canada, and I've forgotten the others now, and I'm not going to go into the link because it'll take me too long, but several countries, South Africa, and I think Australia or New Zealand, and they compared the law across all of those countries, and basically, although there are significant differences, and those differences are about the cultures in our different countries, essentially, not surprisingly, if we think of ourselves in a post-imperial world, the philosophies behind them, the principles behind them are very, very similar. So I think in terms of equality legislation, that sense that people have a right, regardless of race, colour, creed, disability, to achieve their goals, and have a right for the world that we're in to accommodate them rather than to exclude them, I think is the principle that we have there. Our professional, statutory and regulatory bodies, and clearly from what you've been saying this morning, the Nursing and Midwifery Board in Ireland is very, very similar to the Nursing and Midwifery Council for me, is interested in public protection, it's interested in the reputation of the professions, and it sets the standards for education and practice. So they are the givens, the absolute givens that we have to meet. Placement concerns, the things that came out of both the research that we've done, but also the other literature that I've read, and the discussions that we have in DIPSIG, is three placement concerns seem to be the ones that come to the top every time. And they've all come up in the last hour and a half that I've been here, not a surprise. So when is it okay for a student not to declare an impairment? When is an adjustment or an accommodation reasonable? And can assessment be compromised where you've got a disabled student? And constantly, again and again and again, they're the things that we're always trying to square, always trying to manage. And against those things, the university and the practice strategies are always a balancing act. We're trying to communicate, we're trying to offer support, we're trying to develop good policies and procedures. We're trying to look at assessment, so we design out discrimination at the same time as designing in, making sure at every stage we're genuinely assessing competence at the right time, at the right level, at the right pace for all of our students. And I'm sure we haven't talked about it yet today, but certainly the other thing behind that is the defensive back foot, which is the complaints and appeals. We don't want complaints from disabled students saying they've been inappropriately treated. None of us wants to have a situation where you look at their story and you think, gosh, could have done that better. So all the time we're trying to manage that from that perspective as well. So that for me is the backdrop. And I suppose I just wanted to say a few words about disability before I move on to some other things. I don't know whether you know where this is. Can anybody know where this is? If you've been there, you probably know. If you haven't been there, you won't have a clue. It's a train station. Yes, it's a train station. Yeah, there's not in you. It's Italy. It's Italy. Yes, good. I should have brought some chocolate here. Clearly, it's Venice. It's Venice, and the reason it's there is you walk out of the railway station in Venice, you look out at the vista, which is that way, and you can see the Grand Canal and one of the bridges over, and the Vaporetta waiting to pick you up, and it's stepped. Venice is a place which is structurally disabling for anybody who has a physical disability. I'm not sure if it would be possible to take somebody who is a wheelchair user to Venice, because even the most modern bridge that they've built has steps up both sides, narrow, deep steps up both sides. So Venice is a very disabling place. And in terms of reasonable accommodation, there's not a lot you can do about Venice. But it's one of those things that we classically talk about, medical and social models of disability. And so if you like, Venice, beautiful though it is a living example, if you like, of a medical model of disability, which is that the disability is my problem, it's my disability, my impairment. The city is there, and I take the city as the city is. And so this idea that the disability is invested in the human, in the person, rather than invested in the society in which they live. The contrast, and certainly Colin Barnes and Mercer here has been a real advocate of this in his life, is that sense of the social model of disability, where what it basically says is most things that we call disabling or a disability or an impairment, if society was managed differently, would not be disabling for that person. And I suppose, computer science and all the jobs that are done in IT these days, you can do really high-powered jobs where you don't need to be able to walk, talk, leave the house. There are a lot of things now in terms of careers. There's a lot of things that we can do with assistive technology which make that disability go away. So we have this social versus medical model of disability. And I think that's always very interesting for us in the health professions, because I think there is a very dominant medical model for us, both in the way we think about disability and impairment and in the way the services and the cultures that we're in exist. And so for me, there were four key issues that came out of the data and the discussion and the debates and the agonising and the work that we've done since I first got involved in this. And I guess I should say at this moment, I still feel like a visitor to this. I'm not like Alison and Phil and Francis. My job is not around disability. I've never had a job that's around disability.
Oh, sorry.
Well, neither of you have. Yeah. You seem to have got the ticket. But well, maybe that's similar for a lot of us then. Lots of us didn't come into disability as experts in that or as researchers in that. But we're curious and trying to find out. And so the data that we've discovered and the discussions we have and reading other people's research, there seem to me to be four things which we'll have a bit of a discussion about today. The first is you can't assume that you know that somebody's disabled. The second is all the emotive stuff that's around disability. The third one is around this issue about fitness to practice. And the final one is about risk assessment. And so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on each of those. And you will realise by now I can talk pretty fast, and I will keep going, and I'm very happy to, and you can ask questions at the end, but please don't hesitate to ask. The first one, and this has come up a little bit already this morning, is who is disabled? Right at the very, very beginning, I was working with a young woman called Lizzie Walker, who was my research assistant, and herself a disabled person and a disabled activist. And she started playing with the data. She was good with data. Started playing with our student record system, because what we were trying to work out what population and sample we had. And she sort of came to me early on and said, we don't know who the disabled students are. We knew who the disabled students were here, who had declared a disability on their application form, had gone to see the disability services, had said that they were happy to be known to everybody, and were on the database. That was one group of people. We could find those. We knew, but from an ethical perspective, we couldn't use, because I could get into the data. I knew that the number of people who were known to us but invisible was bigger than that, because there were people who declared on their application form but had chosen not to go to disability service and didn't want to be known. So because I was relatively senior, I could go into ACES and I could look and I could do a search for everybody who put disability tick in the disability box. And that number is bigger than that number. So straight away I've got a subset of students here who I can't treat as disabled, I can't support as disabled, I can't talk to about being disabled, but I know have ticked the disability box. So those two. But then we started to think again, there's also the group of students who know jolly well that they've got a disability, but actually choose not even to tell the university on their application form. So this is somebody who knows they've got a disability and has made a decision before they've even started at university that they're not going to mention it to anybody. Thank you very much, it's my business, it's nothing to do with you. And they haven't mentioned it. And then the fourth group, which often we find, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, about your fourth years when they go out as interns, or sometimes it's when we have a step change in their assessment levels, that all of a sudden we have a student where somebody says to them, have you ever actually talked to anybody about whether you've got dyslexia? And suddenly they look at you and say, is that what it is? I didn't realise. So we sometimes have students quite far through their degrees who are suddenly coming forward with a disability. And also students who become ill as they go along. And I think that's the really interesting nuanced one here is about mental health, which was raised earlier on, which is you could have somebody who arrives at the beginning of their year who doesn't, at their degree, doesn't have a mental health problem, but develops a mental health problem, or it becomes apparent throughout the course. And so there are things that can change, or other disabilities that can change, but more likely one around mental health that will change throughout the course. So it's a bit of a problem knowing who is disabled, which brings us back to the universal design. That the more we can design things so that we don't have hidden barriers to disabled students, the better things get. The second one was for me was all the things about emotions, and here I've used direct quotes from the research that we did. So this is a direct quote from a registrant. So this is a registrant working in the NHS who is disabled. And this person says, I try not to push it too much because people get fed up. You know, they've all got their own problems, away from work, physical, mental, whatever. So I try not to say too much. I don't think that any of them know that I'm registered disabled because I've never told them. And that was quite common. We had lots of disabled people, either who we interviewed or who answered the survey, who said that they didn't declare their disability at work. So these were working health professionals, registrants, who were saying, actually, I don't tell. And there's loads of other quotes where people say, well, if I need to tell somebody, then I tell somebody, but my work colleagues don't need to know. Or they'll say, there's one or two people I've told because I know who I can tell and who I can't tell. And there was a real sense of the qualified staff setting a bar, which was disability wasn't something that they talked about, which was really quite emotional for them, in the sense of saying, this is about me, it's not something I talk about at work. From the disabled students' perspective, there were, as you can expect, there were some negative comments along the way. And for me, it's been quite negative in many ways, having that sort of diagnosis and just the responses to it. And another one, I think people just see the equipment that comes with you, the wheelchair, the white stick, before they see you as a person and what you're capable of. So there were some of those comments like that. One of the students told a story. He'd had a period of depression before he'd started nursing, and he He'd had a suicide attempt and had been on the medical ward, having had a suicide attempt, recovered, moved on, got a place on the course, on a medical ward, and there's a young man in the ward who's a suicide attempt. And he picks up all the negativity from the staff about bed waster, you know, what's he doing here? And immediately, where he might, with a different attitude, have actually disclosed and talked about what it had been like for him, says absolutely nothing to staff, but feels he has a really positive relationship with the patient and feels that he reaches out to the patient in a way that maybe he wouldn't have been able to do if he hadn't had that experience himself. And that kind of brings me on to, there were a lot of real positive comments, both from the disabled students, but also in the survey, really positive comments about disability and about how rich having a disabled person in the team can be, how much one can learn. And this from a dyslexic student saying, even though I'm dyslexic, I have students come up to me that aren't dyslexic, and they're asking me how to do things, how to structure. I'm very good at structuring my work and putting it into context, because I've had to learn these mechanisms to cope. And I think, have we lost Nessa? Yes. I was smiling, you know, Nessa will be really, really good at doing some of those things. We've all had shambolic weeks or shambolic times in our lives, haven't we, where we couldn't keep up. She's had to learn how to discipline herself. And her, you know, the minute I was qualified, it was fine. Working on a really, really busy, difficult ward and getting a job in a prestigious hospital in London, you know, she's obviously doing the business and has learnt to do those things and become that person. And the other really emotional thing that came out of the data was this sense that no matter how much we might care about disabled students and no matter how much we might want to accommodate for people and do all of those sorts of things, the bottom line is it's about the patients, it's not about us. It's not about the students, it's not about us, it's about them, it's about the patients. And so on the survey, one of the comments, we need to safeguard our patients as well as our staff. So there's a balance. And one of the disabled registrants saying, you've got to think of the service as well, I suppose, you know, because we've been down this one member of staff, so other people have to work harder. And we've all been in that situation, haven't we? Anybody who's a clinician here, you know, somebody's off sick, somebody's poorly, something's gone wrong, and everybody else has to work twice as hard to cover for that person, because you don't always get another member of staff. And as those of you who are managers, you know, you haven't always got a budget to cover for somebody who's off sick. So there always is that sense that actually it isn't about me, it's about the service, we're a team.
Just on that note, it's interesting though when something isn't labelled as a disability, how it's actually accepted more. One of our interns had an accident, which means that she can't lift more than 5 kilos.
Yes. And
she hasn't gone through access services because she was an employee at the time, so she went to walk it out. We got a letter from our orthopaedic surgeon saying she can't lift more than 5 kilos. So she's working in baby wards where she looks after neonates that don't weigh over 5 kilos. She won't be able to work on the children's ward because she won't be able to lift those children. But there's no hassle.
But nobody minds.
Nobody minds it because it was just normal.
Yeah. The thing I start to think about there is about legitimate and illegitimate, you know, acceptable and unacceptable. And there's a whole load of kind of medical humanities, sociology, psychology research to be done there about where that line is between having something. It's like sometimes we want a diagnosis, don't we? People remember all the stuff about myalgic encephalitis and post-viral syndrome and yuppie flu and all of that sort of thing about degrading those things about fatigue. And seeing them as not a legitimate illness, whereas somebody who has an acute bout of flu or breaks their leg or one of those sorts of things is a much more legitimate illness rather than a disability. You're right. Yeah, absolutely right. The next area was around fitness to practice, and this was a survey response which really hit us. We spent a lot of time debating and discussing this. And what this survey respondent bothered to spend a lot of time writing really was disabled students need to be assessed as being competent to practice in the same way as other students. My concerns are where they are assessed against lesser criteria, which may affect their ability to carry out roles once they're qualified. For example, a reduced caseload management. And I think this was something like health visiting, where you could, as a reasonable adjustment or a reasonable accommodation throughout the placement, you might say, well, this person can't manage a caseload of 6 or 10 or whatever, but they can manage a caseload of 3. And what this person was saying is, well, if we assess them all the way through on the caseload of 3, when really, as a registered practitioner, you've got to be able to step up to 6, are we really assessing them at the same level? And this, for me, strikes at the heart of that thing about assessing competence. Because a lot of students believe if they're disabled that they will be assessed as competent at a lower level. And a lot of staff believe that as well. I know they do in the university. Despite all my best efforts, I still get students disclosing to others that a member of staff has said, oh, don't go and get a dyslexia diagnosis because that's just what lazy people do. And while ever I've still got staff who believe that and will actually say it to a student, then I'm a long way off getting to that point of everybody understanding and being on message that competence is competence. And it doesn't matter whether somebody is disabled or they're not disabled. What you're doing is you're helping somebody to jump the bar at the same level as everybody else. And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding, a huge amount of misunderstanding about this, right the way across the board.
Sorry, can I just ask a question? But this comes up a lot.
It does for me.
Yeah, when you go out, and it's an issue, say, for a lot of students maybe with mental health or other issues, while they're as students and they're on the internships. Now, I'm not a nurse, so I'm just telling what we've heard. But I mean, it's obviously down to the nursing boards and the standards. People set the standards. How critical it is to actually, whether you have 8 or 6 or 10 people in a caseload or 2, whatever. But at the end of the day, can you be qualified as a nurse and not be able to manage 6 people at the one time or 3 people or whatever it is? Because at the end of the day, it's qualification, and what you do afterwards may be a nursing journalist, or maybe work for a pharmaceutical company, or it may be to work in the community where you work part-time and maybe visit old people and don't have such a case, or you might decide not to work at all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously it ties in with, there has to be standards, and it's not for me to say what they are, it's down to the nursing board. But you do wonder sometimes how important it is to be qualified as a nurse. If you work, do you have to work all night? That's another one that comes up. Or how big is your caseload? It's like, they need to be challenged, I think, a little bit.
Some countries, and I think the United States, some of the states in the United States are examples of this, have a limited, you can have a limited license. So you can be licensed against a part of the register, but not the whole of the register. In England, and I suspect it's the same for you here, it's all or nothing. You're either on the register or you're not. But there is a big job of work to be done, and I'm sure it exercises you as much as it does me in interpreting what that competence means, because you will have everything from the person who says, if this person can't get here at 7:15 in the morning, they can't be a nurse. Where you have to say, excuse me, there's nothing in the standards that says that getting up for a 7:15 shift is a requirement in terms of competency. Right through to some quite specific things about saying, in this particular thing, in this particular way, case management means this. And really, there is a line below which you haven't actually achieved that. And we're not there. We're not there in England, and I suspect these are still things that you're dealing with too.
And what's interesting is that the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Ireland has just commenced the review of the requirements and standards.
It's interesting.
So I certainly know that I have been involved in that.
Yeah.
So it's good that people that are here that are representative to highlight that. And there really isn't anywhere in our document, nor is there in legislation that does state how many is a caseload. There is work going on at a registered level, trying to do research in relation to that.
What's reasonable?
That states.
Yeah,
And
it is.
The other worrying thing
grey.
is that the board of Alternate here, as far as I know, certainly in relation to the work that UCD have done, have been invited in several times to take part in this. The nursing unions have endorsed the work, but on the board of Alternate haven't been involved at all, which means they're not part of the conversations, they're not part of that dialogue that is exploring things.
Yeah.
And they've missed out on that whole, I think, journey.
Disconnected.
It's a
What happened?
whole journey.
The example that was given there, the children's hospital, that tape recording of it should be disseminated across all of the universities.
Yeah.
Because what you have to do there is like the regulatory body needs to take some responsibility. They have nothing on their website around disability at all.
No.
So
And they don't actually see it as their role or their task, which is a misconception, because it's only the...
But what they'll say is, these are the competencies. We invest in you as an institution, and you as placement providers, the responsibility for interpreting that. Which,
and in fact, in March 2011, when our resource guide was first launched, we had sent it out to on board Ultronage, asking them to endorse it And in fact, they said excellent work, but we can't do that.
They won't do it. No.
So as a body, they
Yeah.
couldn't do that.
Yeah.
So that
No.
was very disappointing for us. It's not that we were looking for
No.
credit, we just wanted something out there because we
Yeah.
knew it was such an issue to
Yeah.
support people that could be.
And I think in some ways nursing is more difficult than some of the other professions. A midwife needs to be able to deliver babies competently. And really the bottom line is if a midwife can deliver babies competently, then she can probably be, or he can probably be a midwife. And I think quite a few of the other allied health professions are much more specific. There are things about radiography that are very specific. If you can't read a pattern in an x-ray, you can't be a radiographer. It's much more scientific, more hard and fast, whereas nursing, occupational therapy probably is another example, are such ubiquitous professions. They're so broad that it's very, very difficult. Is it all right if I carry on? We're all right? Just keep me to time. I know this is a bit busy, but this was just a little bit of the data which I thought was interesting and sort of reassuring in one way and not in another, which is when we asked, are you confident about safeguards to ensure fitness to practice? Nothing to do with disability at all. 44% of people were either occasionally or never confident with fitness to practice. And I think fitness to practice is an issue for us when we're assessing competence, whether students are disabled or not. So I think that's the real positive thing. And I think the other one was, are you more concerned about fitness to practice for disabled students than non-disabled students? And generally people weren't. We've got over 60% said no, actually, generally most of the time, disability isn't the issue with fitness to practice. We did have some here, and definitely for some people there was a step up. Fitness to practice is an issue. It's more of an issue in disability, but not for everybody. So I think that there is some light in the tunnel there, and there's some space for dialogue, if you like. Which brings me back to risk. Managing risk is complicated. It needs to be tailored to individuals, but it's got to be transparent and fair. It needs to enable the students to learn and demonstrate competence, but not put patients at risk. And so if I go back, and I'm conscious we're out of time, so this might be something to discuss. My suggestion is that to take the emotion out of this is to try and talk about principles. So for me, what Stuart Walker, who was one of the other people who I did the research with, said is what we've got at the moment, what the data was showing us is a model where the perception of risk is the big thing. That's in front of everything. And the support you might give students and the way you manage the barriers sits behind it. Trying to move away from that into a more principle-based or more social model, for me, is to have some principles. So the disclosure principle for me is that if the impairment, in the context of the placement, is disabling for that person, they can't do the stuff as well as they need to be able to do it to be competent, and it could be a risk to themselves or others, and there are adjustments or accommodations that would be reasonable, then it really is reasonable to expect a professional person to disclose in those circumstances. Somebody who cares about the profession and has got the right professional values, which are part of the standards, ought in those circumstances to be considered appropriate to disclose. And the second one for me is around the reasonable adjustments or accommodations. And for that one, does the student have an impairment that, again, in the context of the placement, and it's always about context, could be overcome by an accommodation? And is that adjustment reasonable in terms of the time and the cost and the acceptability? Then yes, that adjustment should be available. And if it can be made routine, it should be. And I think your example of the template handover was a really good example of that. That something came up that was useful for a dyslexic student, and you think, you know what? Everybody could use that. The read-write software that, I've forgotten the name again, that Nessa mentioned. The read-write software, once you've got one licence for that in a university, it's easy to have 1,000. Just put it on every single PC in the university, and then everybody has got rewrite software. So some of the things can be done. Putting ramps and lifts in rather than just steps is something we've all done because of disability legislation. And then the final one for me around competence, which is in the context of competence assessment in this practice placement. Is the threshold standard the same for all the students? So is everybody being judged equally? Are people who've got accommodations, have they been agreed and actioned? Or if it's not appropriate to have an accommodation in this circumstance, is that clearly documented? Does the student know? And does the student understand that? And if all those things are in place, then in a sense you judge the student as if you're behind a veil of ignorance and you judge them all exactly the same. And I think in some ways, particularly for the mental health problems that we have with students, that's particularly important, because if you know somebody's got a mental health problem, you shouldn't actually be taking that into account. If they can reach the standard of competency the same as everybody else, the idea that there might be some additional risk there, you can't second judge the fact, oh well, they've done it today but they've got a mental health problem, they might not be able to do it tomorrow. All of us might not be able to do it tomorrow. We don't know what's around the corner. And so it is that thing about stepping back from the emotion of it and sticking with the principles is my suggestion. So just to conclude, it's always risky preparing students for professional practice. It always has been and it always will be. It was when we were youngsters, and it will be when we've retired and the gang of people have turned over. Risk assessment needs to be individual, and but it also needs to be based on principles. So it's not an emotional response. It's a sensitive response to a student, and it's principles based. We can do things differently to remove barriers, and I've been really heartened by some of the things you're doing. I'm really impressed that you're getting disability stuff into your preceptorship, because it isn't in the standards for education for the equivalent people in England, and it really, really needs to be. And I think the really, really important one is we need to be confident to set standards and be prepared to fail people and not be frightened of failing people. Not worry that somebody's going to play the kind of disability card and say, you've treated me badly because I'm disabled. If we've got all of those things right, then we look after our disabled students and our disabled colleagues well and confidently and appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you.